I was already dead the moment he opened his eyes and didn't look for me first. For 3 years, I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, reading to him, praying he'd wake up. His parents praised me. His friends called me loyal. Everyone whispered about the wedding they knew was coming, how we'd walk down the aisle once he recovered. I believed it too. Believed in fairy tales stitched with suffering. Until the day he finally opened those familiar eyes, blinked into the blinding hospital light, and asked for someone else. Not me. Not the woman who never left his side. He whispered another name, soft, broken, precious. I smiled through the crack of my breaking ribs and said, "I'll go get her." That was the day I realized I hadn't been saving him. I had been burying myself alive, one heartbeat at a time. And I was done. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and hope. A cruel mix. Nurses bustled by, whispering about miracles. His parents cried, tears of joy, relief, future plans. No one noticed me standing there, silent, invisible, already a ghost. I didn't correct the nurse when she called me just a friend. I didn't explain the hours I'd poured into him, the pieces of my youth stitched to his survival. It didn't matter anymore. His heart had spoken. It hadn't whispered my name. It had summoned someone else, a girl who once laughed at my hand-me-downs and flirted with him under my nose. It was almost poetic. The universe didn't shout its betrayal. It murmured it softly, while the machines beeped their sterile applause. And for the first time in years, I let the silence fall between us and did not rush to fill it. At home, I packed my things quietly. I hadn't even realized how much of my life had shrunk to fit around him. My books, my shoes, my paintings, all stored neatly away in corners forgotten. I hadn't lived for myself in so long that moving through my own apartment felt like visiting a stranger's museum. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just moved carefully, methodically, like peeling my skin off one layer at a time. Every framed picture of us smiled down mockingly. Every drawer I opened coughed up pieces of dreams I didn't recognize anymore. I folded them, boxed them, burned them, until the only thing left was space. Space to become someone who wasn't built entirely around loving a man who couldn't remember me when it mattered most. The first call came a few days later. His mother, breathless with excitement. "He's asking about you now. He wants to see you." I stared at my phone, the screen lighting up with a name that once meant family. And for a moment, the old instincts flared, the urge to run back, to be needed. But I swallowed it down, because I knew what this was. Guilt, not love. Recognition, not choice. He hadn't reached for me first. And I deserved to be first to someone. Always. I silenced the phone, turned it face down on the kitchen table, and poured myself a glass of wine. Because leaving wasn't weakness, it was choosing myself for the first time in years. Haley, the girl he had called for, visited him daily now. Posted smiling photos from his bedside. Tagged him. Tagged herself. Wrote captions like, "Some bonds never break." I didn't double tap. I didn't comment. I just watched from the distance. I carved for myself, realizing with every passing hour how much I had twisted myself into believing loyalty would guarantee love. Haley hadn't waited. She hadn't prayed. She hadn't sacrificed. But she had what I was supposed to have, his attention. And strangely, it didn't burn anymore. It just clarified. Love isn't earned by martyrdom. It's given by choice. And he hadn't chosen me. Not even when I was the only hand he had left to hold. I started small. A new haircut, shorter, lighter. As the scissors fell around me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't just hair. It was the version of me who waited, who pleaded silently for scraps of affection, who bent until she broke. I tipped the stylist heavily and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, blinking like someone seeing color for the first time. Every step I took away from that hospital, that history, was a stitch in the new life I was weaving, one that didn't require anyone else's permission to bloom. At work, I volunteered for projects I used to turn down. Stayed late, led meetings, pushed ideas. People noticed. My boss smiled at me differently, like I was someone who could lead, not just follow. I realized I had spent so long hiding behind, waiting, that I forgot how powerful I could be when I chose movement. Not for anyone else. For myself. Success didn't heal the wounds overnight, but it reminded me that my value was never tied to the ring I didn't get, or the name he didn't call. It was stitched into my spine, my voice, my refusal to stay buried. One night, I boxed up the last of the hospital mementos, the cards, the photos, the press flowers. I didn't rip them up. I didn't scream. I simply placed them in a box, taped it shut, and wrote across it, "Thank you for teaching me that love shouldn't cost my life." Then I carried it to the trash and left it there, heavy but cleansing. Because real endings don't come with fireworks or dramatic speeches. Sometimes they happen quietly when you finally realize you are the prize, not the placeholder. And you refuse to stand in the waiting room of someone else's heart ever again. He texted me weeks later. "I miss you. I remember everything now." I stared at the message for a long time. Once, those words would have wrecked me, would have made me pack a bag and run to his side. But now they felt like an old song I used to cry to, but couldn't even hum anymore. I didn't reply. I didn't block him. I just let the message sit there, unanswered, a ghost of a life I no longer wanted. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence isn't weakness, it's sovereignty. I booked a solo trip to the mountains. No return date. Just a cabin, a stack of books, and a sky full of stars. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it. I simply went. Because healing isn't a performance. It's a private revolution. And somewhere between the winding roads and the crisp, pine-scented air, I realized I wasn't running from the past anymore. I was walking into a future that was finally mine. The cabin was small but perfect. One room, a fireplace, creaky wooden floors that smelled of history. I unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet. No buzzing phones. No hospital monitors. No heavy sighs of obligation. Just whined through pine trees, and the steady thud of my own heart, healing beat by beat. The first night, I built a fire and sat on the worn leather couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, letting the flames hypnotize me. I thought about who I had been, who I had loved, and who I was finally becoming. Not a shadow, not a nursemaid, not a placeholder. I was mine now, every broken piece, every scar. And in the glow of that fire, I finally felt warm for reasons that had nothing to do with someone else's approval. In the mornings, I hiked. Not far. Just enough to feel the burn in my legs and the chill of the mountain air in my lungs. Every step was a prayer. Not to a god or a man, but to myself. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't check my reflection. I didn't scroll through anyone's life but my own. I walked past wildflowers and streams, listened to birds calling to no one in particular, and for the first time, I didn't feel lost without a hand to hold. I was holding myself now, and it was enough. More than enough. Every time I crested a hill, breathless and aching, I whispered, "Still here?" Because surviving isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just one more step forward, when no one else can see the climb. I met an older woman at the market one afternoon, buying apples. She had silver hair tied back in a loose braid and hands calloused from a lifetime of living. She smiled at me like she knew everything. "You're not running away," she said softly as I picked up a jar of honey. "You're running towards something." I laughed awkwardly. She shrugged, bagged her apples, and said, "Good. Most people never figure that out." I never caught her name. I didn't need to. Sometimes strangers say exactly what your heart needs to hear before you're ready to say it yourself. I held on to her words like a secret, tucked between my ribs where old wounds used to live. At night, I journaled by candlelight, not the painful kind, the desperate, spiraling words of a woman bleeding on the page. These were different. Short notes, gratitudes, tiny victories. I cooked a new recipe. I watched the sunset without thinking about anyone else. I laughed, really laughed today. They weren't grand. They were stitches, sewing a new life thread by delicate thread. And each word made it clearer. Healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about loving the woman who crawled out of the wreckage and still chose hope, still chose herself. One evening, I sat by the fire, a cup of tea in my hand, and realized I hadn't thought about him all day. Not once. Not while hiking. Not while laughing with the woman at the market. Not even when the sunset turned the sky into something too beautiful to name. I hadn't missed him. I hadn't wished he was there to see it with me. That absence didn't feel like a hole. It felt like a healed scar. The kind you run your fingers over sometimes, not in pain, but in awe. I lived through that, you think, and I still get to live after. A letter came from the hospital a few weeks later. Routine. His mother had written it, thanking me for everything I had done, apologizing if they had made assumptions. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because I no longer needed to be seen by people who had only ever noticed me when it was convenient. Gratitude offered too late isn't healing. It's housekeeping. And I wasn't cleaning up anyone else's mess anymore. My life was already shining, clean, simple, whole. Sometimes I'd pass couples on the trail, laughing, holding hands, kissing at scenic overlooks. It didn't sting. It didn't make me ache for what I thought I lost. It made me smile, because I didn't want their love. I didn't want a placeholder, or a maybe, or a promise built on guilt. I wanted something real. And real wasn't desperate. It wasn't about being saved or owed. It was about being chosen again and again, even when the easy thing would be to leave. I didn't have that yet, but I believed, fiercely, that someday I would. And in the meantime, I wasn't lonely. I was simply becoming. One afternoon, I hiked to a lake high in the hills. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting a sky so endless it made my chest ache. I stood there, boots sinking into the mud, wind tangling my hair, and whispered, "I forgive you." Not to him, not to Haley, but to myself, for staying too long, for believing too blindly, for giving love like it was a currency I had to spend to be worthy. I forgave myself for all the ways I had dimmed my own light, hoping someone else would finally see it. And as the wind carried my words across the lake, I felt something in me settle. Not end. Begin. I started sketching again. Just rough drawings, mountains, cabins, faces I saw in passing. Things I hadn't touched since college, when dreams were still sharp and unbruised. It wasn't about being good. It wasn't about showing anyone. It was about remembering what it felt like to create something just for me. Every line I traced was a thread tying me back to the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed before she bent herself into someone else's life. I wasn't her anymore. I was better, stronger, brighter, and she would have been so proud of me. I didn't check my phone anymore, waiting for an apology. I didn't replay old conversations, wondering what I could have said differently. I didn't need closure. I didn't need regret. All I needed was exactly what I had: a sky bigger than my past, a heart braver than my scars, and a future finally, fully, beautifully mine. I stayed 3 months in that cabin, longer than I intended, long enough for the locals to recognize my face at the market, to know my coffee order at the tiny cafe. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't waiting. I was living day by day, not because someone needed me, but because I deserved to see who I was without the weight of being everything for everyone else. And the woman I discovered, she was fierce in a quiet way, a kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted from rooftops. It lived in the way she carried herself, in the way she smiled at her own reflection without flinching. That kind of strength, it wasn't built in love stories. It was forged in fires other people lit and thought would destroy her. A letter from Haley arrived next. I almost didn't open it, almost threw it straight into the fire. But something inside me said, read it. Not for her sake. For mine. It was short, apologetic, confusing. She said she missed me. Said she never meant to hurt me. Said she wished things were different. I read it once, twice, and realized none of it mattered. Not anymore. Her words were a lock looking for a key I no longer carried. Healing means you don't need to revisit the ruins to prove you survived. You simply keep walking. I didn't respond. Not because I hated her. I didn't. I had no energy left for hatred. It was too heavy, too consuming. Instead, I folded the letter, tucked it into the back of my journal, and wrote underneath it, "Closure is a decision, not a conversation." And with that, I moved on. Because I didn't owe her anything, not my forgiveness, not my anger, not my time. The best revenge against betrayal is not bitterness. It's building a life so radiant, they can't even recognize the girl they thought they could break. One rainy afternoon, I found an art class in town, open to walk-ins. I signed up on a whim, smudged charcoal across thick paper, laughed at my messy lines. There was a man there, too, gentle, kind eyes. He helped me wash my hands when I struggled with the stubborn stains. Didn't ask for my number, didn't push, just smiled and said, "You have an artist's spirit." I hadn't heard a compliment that pure in years. It wasn't about my looks, my loyalty, my usefulness. It was about me. And I tucked it away like a pearl, small but precious. In the evenings, I stopped waiting for permission to enjoy things. I opened a bottle of wine, even if no one else was drinking. I danced barefoot in the kitchen, with no music playing. I wore my best dress to dinner for one. Because I didn't need a special occasion to feel special anymore. I didn't need validation to know I was enough. Every ordinary day, I chose joy was an extraordinary rebellion against the life they tried to trap me in. And that was the real glow-up, finding magic in the mundane and realizing I was the magician all along. I visited the lake again before I left the cabin for good. This time, I didn't whisper apologies or promises. I just stood there, breathing in the wild air, letting the silence wrap around me like a blessing. There were no ghosts left to chase. No memories sharp enough to cut. Just me, a woman rebuilt from ashes and soft edges, and an unbreakable spine. I didn't cry. I didn't make dramatic declarations. I simply placed a small stone at the edge of the water, a marker not for grief, but for gratitude. Gratitude for surviving. Gratitude for leaving. Gratitude for choosing myself. When I returned to the city, everything looked smaller. The skyline, the people, the problems that used to tower over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't shrinking to fit into lives that were never built for someone like me. I didn't slide back into old routines. I made new ones. Fresh flowers on the table every week. Sunday mornings reserved for myself. Yoga at sunrise. Writing without editing every raw emotion into something polite. I didn't return as the same woman. I came back reborn. And no one, not him, not Haley, not even the old me, could ever fit me into that smaller frame again. People from my past tried to reconnect. Old friends. Acquaintances who wanted to catch up. Some curious, some guilty. I didn't ignore them, but I didn't bend backward either. I smiled. I listened. And when it was time, I let them drift away. Healing doesn't mean inviting everyone back into your life. Sometimes it just means wishing them well and closing the door gently behind them. I wasn't building walls out of anger. I was building boundaries out of wisdom. There's a difference. And standing behind those boundaries, I found peace, not loneliness, not fear, just peace. He reached out again, an email this time. Longer, full of regret, full of nostalgia. He missed our life. He wished he had seen things clearer. I closed the laptop without reading the rest. Because memory is tricky. It polishes old wounds until they sparkle, disguising the rot underneath. I wasn't angry at him anymore. But I wasn't going back. You don't walk barefoot into broken glass once you've learned how sweet solid ground feels. I wished him healing. But I wouldn't be part of his redemption story. I had my own to finish. And mine was just getting better with every chapter one dared to write. I found a new apartment closer to the art district. Exposed brick walls. Big windows that caught the sunset perfectly. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't polished. But it felt right. Like a canvas, still blank but full of possibilities. I filled it slowly, pieces that made me happy. A chair too big for one person, but perfect for curling up with a book. A record player with crackling vinyl that made the whole space feel alive. I didn't rush to fill the empty spaces. I let them breathe. Because for the first time, I understood emptiness wasn't loneliness. It was room to grow. Every Saturday, I visited the market for fresh flowers. Not for anyone else. Not for company. Just for me. I chose the brightest ones, sunflowers, dahlias, wild snapdragons, and filled the apartment with color. It became a ritual of self-celebration. A small, stubborn rebellion against the version of me that once thought love meant waiting in sterile hospital rooms. Now, love looked like choosing the flowers I wanted, cooking meals I craved, reading books that fed my spirit. I didn't wait to be chosen anymore. I chose myself, every single day, with every small, beautiful decision. Work became something different too. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a stage where I let my light unapologetically shine. I pitched bold ideas, took leadership roles, mentored new hires who saw in me something I hadn't fully recognized before, a woman who wasn't afraid to take up space. My boss noticed. Promotions followed. But the real reward wasn't the title change or the bigger paycheck. It was standing in a room, speaking with authority, knowing I wasn't pretending to be strong anymore. I was strong. The kind of strong that doesn't have to flex to be felt. At night, I wrote. Not stories about heartbreak, but about rebirth. About women who weren't saved by princes, but by their own hands. About moments when survival became an act of art, not just endurance. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't catharsis. It was claiming the narrative, rewriting the ending they thought they scripted for me. Every word felt like another brick in the fortress of a life no betrayal could touch again. I didn't write for him to see. I didn't write for her to regret. I wrote for the woman who waited and the woman who walked away. One afternoon, I stumbled onto a local gallery hosting an open exhibition. On a whim, I submitted one of my sketches, a rough charcoal portrait of a woman standing alone at the edge of a cliff, wind whipping through her hair, face turned toward a sky thick with stars. I didn't think they'd accept it. They did. Opening night, I stood in the corner, sipping wine, watching strangers study my work. One woman leaned in, whispered, "She looks free." I smiled to myself. She didn't know it was me she was looking at. She didn't have to. I knew. That was enough. Sometimes memories would flicker at odd times, passing a park bench where we once sat, hearing a song we danced to at some long-forgotten party. But they didn't slice anymore. They didn't drag me under. They floated by, weightless. A chapter closed. A door I no longer needed to knock on. Healing didn't erase the past. It made it irrelevant. And now when I thought of him, or her, or those long nights by his hospital bed, I didn't feel like the girl left behind. I felt like the woman who walked forward anyway, and never looked back. Adrian entered my life like a quiet song. I met him at the gallery. He complimented my sketch, thoughtful, genuine. Not impressed with my survival story. Not trying to save me. Just seeing me as I was. We talked about books, music, dreams that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. He didn't ask about my past. He didn't probe my scars. He met me where I stood, whole, imperfect, unapologetic. It felt unfamiliar at first. To be seen without being measured. To be chosen without being pitted. But slowly I let it happen. Because healing doesn't just mean protecting your heart. Sometimes it means trusting yourself enough to open it again. We started slowly. Coffee dates. Walks along the river. Late night talks about nothing and everything. He never made promises he couldn't keep. Never offered rescue. Only partnership. Only presence. I realized love didn't have to be desperate to be real. It didn't have to hurt to prove its depth. It could be soft. Steady. Sure. And for the first time, I wasn't measuring myself against someone else's needs. I wasn't shrinking, bending, erasing. I was expanding, becoming. And he stood beside me, not ahead, not behind, just there, hand in hand, step for step. I didn't tell him everything at once. He didn't need the full history to love the woman I was now. But one night, curled under a shared blanket on my too-big couch, I told him a piece of it, the hospital, the heartbreak, the girl who almost disappeared. He listened. No pity, no fixing, just a quiet squeeze of my hand, a kiss to my forehead, and a simple, "I'm glad you chose you." I didn't cry. I smiled. Because love like that doesn't heal the wounds. It honors the way you already healed yourself. And that was worth every scar. I started building dreams again, the ones I once tucked away in dusty corners of my mind because I thought they were selfish. I signed up for painting classes, applied for a leadership program at work, sketched out the first chapters of a novel I'd been too scared to write. And every time doubt whispered in my ear, I reminded myself, I had already survived the worst nights. I had already chosen myself in the darkest hour. So what was there left to fear? If I could rebuild my life from ashes, I could certainly build my dreams from hope. The invitations started rolling in again. Engagement parties, baby showers, dinner gatherings. There was a time when each envelope would have felt like a knife, a reminder of the life I thought I'd have. But now, I chose what I attended and what I let pass. I didn't force smiles or fake joy. I celebrated where it felt genuine. I declined where it felt heavy. No guilt, no explanations. Protecting my peace was no longer selfish. It was sacred. And anyone who couldn't understand that didn't deserve a seat in the life I was crafting so carefully, so intentionally. Adrian and I started taking trips, short weekend getaways to places neither of us had ever been. We hiked mountains, wandered through sleepy towns, watched sunsets from unfamiliar beaches. Each trip wasn't about escape. It was about exploration. Not just of new places, but of new parts of ourselves, of each other. There were no Instagram posts, no public displays for validation. Just the two of us, quietly building something real. Love that wasn't about proving anything to the world, but about finding comfort in each other's silences. And somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't afraid of being loved anymore. I opened my first solo art show 6 months later. Nothing huge, just a rented studio, white walls, soft lighting. I hung my sketches, women standing tall, hands unbound, eyes wide open. Survivors, dreamers, warriors. I didn't invite everyone I knew. I didn't plaster it across social media. I simply opened the doors and let the right people find their way in. And when the first stranger stood in front of my favorite piece and whispered, "I feel seen," I knew it wasn't about selling art. It was about sharing the survival story etched into every line, every brushstroke. A story I lived. A story I conquered. Sometimes, I still woke up from old dreams, flashbacks of hospital beeping, whispered promises, betrayal wrapped in tenderness. But they didn't crush me anymore. I would wake, breathe, place my hand over my heart, and remind myself that life is over. That chapter is closed. Dreams are just echoes. They don't have to shape the day ahead. And every time I chose the present over the past, I built another layer of armor. Not cold, not bitter, but soft and unbreakable all at once. I ran into an old acquaintance at a coffee shop one rainy morning. She blinked when she saw me, like she was expecting the broken girl from the old stories. "You look different," she said carefully. I smiled, warm but certain. "I am." And it wasn't meant as a boast. It was simply the truth. She asked about him, briefly, nervously. I just shrugged. Some things are better left in the past. She nodded, changed the subject, and that small, awkward conversation felt like a victory. Because healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly across a table, sipping coffee, and knows exactly when to leave the old ghosts unspoken. I didn't hate him. I didn't hate Haley. I didn't hate anyone. Hatred would have tied me to them forever. anchored me to the weight I worked so hard to release. I didn't wish them misery. I didn't wish them regret. I simply wished them distance. I hoped they built whatever life they thought they deserved, far, far from the woman who would no longer shrink herself to fit into their fractured worlds. Wishing them nothing was the final severance. It wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. I started writing letters I never intended to send. To my younger self. To the girl who sat by a hospital bed and thought love would fix everything. To the girl who packed boxes in silence. To the girl who chose herself without applause. I wrote to tell her, you were never wrong for loving deeply. You were never weak for staying loyal. But you were never meant to stay small. And she heard me. Every word stitched another wound closed. Every sentence lifted another chain from her shoulders. She wasn't broken. She was becoming. Spring came faster than I expected. One day, there was snow. The next, green buds pushing stubbornly through the dirt. I sat on my tiny balcony, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up. It felt like the seasons inside me had changed too. I was no longer clawing my way out of winter. I was blooming slowly, steadily. Not for anyone's gaze. Not for anyone's validation. Just because it was time. And the girl who once thought survival was the end goal now knew surviving was just the beginning. Thriving was where the real magic lived. The past was not my home anymore. The future wasn't something I feared anymore. The present, this messy, breathtaking, beautiful present, was finally mine. Summer crept in quietly, and with it, a sense of arrival. I wasn't waiting anymore, for closure, for apologies, for validation. I woke up excited about small things, the smell of fresh coffee, the first page of a new book, the feeling of sun on my face during an aimless walk. Healing hadn't turned me into someone hard and untouchable. It had made me softer in the right places and stronger in the ones that mattered. I wasn't afraid of losing anymore. I had already lost everything once and found something better in its place, myself. Adrian asked me one evening, sitting on a picnic blanket under the stars, "What's your biggest dream now?" I didn't hesitate. Peace, I said. Not the fragile, conditional kind. The deep, earned kind that doesn't shake even when storms roll in. He smiled like he understood perfectly, and maybe he did, because love now wasn't about rescuing each other. It was about building a life where neither of us needed saving. Just a place to land when the world got too loud. I opened a small online store for my art pieces. Not chasing fame, not chasing money. Just offering pieces of my heart to whoever needed them. Every sale, every message from strangers saying, "This made me feel seen," stitched another thread into the tapestry of a life I was proud of. I wasn't trying to be perfect anymore. I wasn't performing survival. I was living fully, messily, joyfully. And if that scared people who only knew the broken version of me, so be it. I wasn't shrinking to make anyone else comfortable ever again. Sometimes, Adrian would catch me staring out the window, lost in thought. He never asked what I was thinking. He just slipped his hand into mine and sat quietly. That was the kind of partnership I never even knew how to hope for before. Someone who didn't demand access to every corner of my mind, but was simply willing to sit with me, whatever weather I carried inside. That was the new definition of love, for me. Presence without pressure. Support without control. Partnership without conditions. A few years later, I bumped into one of his old friends at a bookstore. He recognized me immediately, blinked like he'd seen a ghost. "You look amazing," he said, surprised. I just smiled, thanked him, and kept walking, because I wasn't their memory anymore. I wasn't trapped in their expectations anymore. I had become someone they couldn't even predict, someone they couldn't even reach. And it felt good, not out of revenge, but out of sheer, unapologetic freedom. They had written me off, buried me in the rubble of their selfishness. And yet here I was, thriving in sunlight they never thought I'd see. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through an old journal I'd once kept like a lifeline. So many pages filled with heartbreak, confusion, loneliness. I read them with a strange tenderness, like visiting a version of myself who tried so hard to survive. I didn't cringe. I didn't erase. I simply whispered, "Thank you," to that girl, because she held on when everything told her to give up. She stayed when it would have been easier to let go. And because of her, I got to live this life now, with open hands, open eyes, and an open, unbreakable heart. I didn't need grand victories to feel victorious. I didn't need parades or applause. Victory was waking up with peace instead of panic. Victory was laughing without wondering who was watching. Victory was building a life so full that there was no more room for bitterness. I stopped measuring my healing by how far away I could get from my past. I measured it by how deeply rooted I felt in my present. And every single day, the roots grew stronger. One night, Adrian asked if I believed in second chances. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I believe in choosing better," I said, "not repeating." He smiled, pulled me closer, and said, "Good, because I'm not here to fix your past. I'm here to build your future, with you." And that, right there, was the difference between who I used to love and who stood before me now. One saw my brokenness as an inconvenience. The other saw it as a mosaic, something more beautiful because it had been broken. I still visit the lake sometimes. Alone. No letters. No whispers. Just silence and reflection. I don't go there to mourn anymore. I go to honor the girl who stood at that shoreline and decided she was worth saving. I sit under the endless sky and think, look how far you've come. Not despite them, not because of them, but because somewhere, deep inside, you remembered you were never made to stay broken. You were always meant to rise. And rise I did, not with vengeance, but with grace so powerful it couldn't be denied. I started hosting small dinners at my apartment. No special reason, no grand events. Just a few people who knew my real heart. We laughed over messy pasta dishes, spilled wine on the table, played records too loud, and danced barefoot in the living room. These were the moments I once begged for, cried for. Now they unfolded without begging, without fear. Not because life became easier, but because I had become braver. And that bravery built a world where I was loved correctly. Not because someone pitied me, but because I showed up fully and they stayed anyway. I bought myself a ring. No diamonds. No promises. Just a simple gold band I wore on my right hand. A vow to myself. A reminder that no matter who came or went, no matter what changed, I was committed first and foremost to my own joy. I didn't need someone to give me a ring to feel chosen anymore. I chose myself every morning, every messy afternoon, every quiet midnight when doubts used to creep in. And that self-commitment, it was stronger than any vow ever whispered in a hospital room. There were still hard days. Days when old wounds ached like phantom limbs. Days when the echoes of betrayal found their way into my quiet spaces. But I no longer feared them. I welcomed them like weather, passing storms that didn't destroy the house I had built. Healing didn't make me untouchable. It made me unshakable. I could bend without breaking now. I could cry without crumbling. Because surviving betrayal isn't about erasing the scars. It's about carrying them like armor, gleaming in the sunlight. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple outside my window, Adrian asked, "If you could tell your past self one thing, what would it be?" I thought for a moment, feeling the weight of everything I had survived. Then I smiled and said, I would tell her that survival isn't the prize. Living is. Because surviving heartbreak was only the beginning. The real victory was choosing to live afterward, not cautiously, not bitterly, but joyfully, recklessly, beautifully alive. We traveled to Italy the following year, walked cobblestone streets, ate gelato at midnight, got lost in alleyways filled with laughter and flowers hanging from balconies. There, under a sky too wide to hold regrets, Adrian knelt, not with a grand speech, not with trembling hands, but with quiet certainty. Not because I saved you, he said, but because you saved yourself, and I'm honored to walk beside you." I said yes, not because I needed him to complete me, but because I knew fully and fiercely that I was already whole, and he loved me because of it, not in spite of it. I didn't lose myself in him. I expanded, flourished. Where once love felt like shackles, now it felt like wings. Where once it demanded sacrifice, now it celebrated my freedom. We built something new, stronger, because it wasn't born from desperation. It was born from choice. And every choice I made now was rooted in the life I had fought so hard to create. A life where I wasn't someone's second thought. A life where I wasn't someone's backup plan. A life where I was finally, gloriously, first. Sometimes I drive by the old hospital. It's still there, still humming with life and loss. I don't stop. I don't cry. I simply nod toward it like you would at an old battlefield. Not with hatred, not with regret, but with honor for the girl who fought there, for the girl who sat in those sterile halls and loved so bravely. She didn't lose because she loved. She won because she refused to stay forgotten. She planted the seeds of the woman I became. And every step I took now was proof that she didn't fight in vain. I published my novel 2 years later. It wasn't about him. Or Haley. It wasn't even about heartbreak. It was about healing. About how sometimes the strongest stories are the ones where the heroine saves herself without needing a single night. It didn't become a bestseller overnight. But it reached the right people, the ones sitting alone, wondering if their survival mattered. And through the pages, I whispered back to them, "It does. You do." The night of the book launch, standing in a small local bookstore, signing copies with a trembling hand, I realized I had done it. I had turned my pain into power, my silence into stories, my loneliness into lanterns for other women walking their own dark roads. And no betrayal, no forgotten love, no lost years could ever take that from me. I didn't just survive what they did to me. I rose, rebuilt, and turned it into something beautiful. I became the person they never thought I could become, and the woman even I had once been too afraid to dream of.